Okay, so we might get started. My name is Lisa Folkes. I'm the Director of Employment for Social Ventures Australia, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar to discuss the What Will It Take report, which is a collaboration between SVA, Apprenticeship Employment Network and PwC. But I want to start first by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from which we, in all of our different parts of Australia, meeting today. For me, that is Gadigal land, part of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Look, I want to then talk about what we're trying to do today. In fact, I should probably start by saying we are recording this session, so if you want to, it'll be distributed to people afterwards, and if you want to pass it on, we'll also distribute the slides. But the purpose of today is to do two things. One is to give you a bit of an overview of the What Will It Take report, which is a collaborative report that has been where the grunt work has been done by PwC, and I'm very grateful for the team at PwC for the amount of effort they put into that, working with Social Ventures Australia and the Apprenticeship Employment Network, which also is the Australian part of the Global Apprenticeship Network. So I'll give you an overview of that report, and then we're going to discuss some of the policy implications and the practice implications from that report. So the bulk of the session will be in a panel discussion and an opportunity for you to put forward any questions or any comments that you would like to that discussion, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about them. And for that panel discussion, we'll also be joined by Professor John Buchanan, who's an expert in employment and skills, and will be a great addition to discussion about what next as someone who's been working in this space for a very long time. So my difficult task first up is to give you a bit of a run through of the report itself. So let me get started on that. Okay, now I'm hoping people can see this. And I'm hoping one of my colleagues will yell at me if they can't.
Yep, it's there.
Okay, excellent, thank you. All right, so let me just start by reminding you of what the challenge is around youth unemployment and employment, which many of you will be familiar with. So over the last 20 years, we have seen steady growth in the number of young people who are unemployed, but perhaps even more significantly underemployed. So underemployment is the definition of it is if you've got some work but you want more. So, and between those two figures, that is the underutilisation report. On average, young people are working less today than they were 20 years ago. Currently, there are over 600,000 young people who are underutilised, either not working or not working as much as they'd like to. That's about 30% of the youth labour force in Australia. Those worst affected with the worst prospects are those without university degrees. Now, those with university degrees are also struggling to find full-time employment, but what's happening is that they are taking up more lower skilled opportunities, and young people without university degrees are increasingly finding themselves left out of the labour market altogether. The other really important thing to understand is that we see that young people's wages are actually declining. So this is from a Productivity Commission report, and they found that between 2001 and 2008, there was real wage growth, not a lot, but there was real wage growth across all age brackets. But from 2008 to 2018, young people's wages actually went backwards, and it was most pronounced for that 15 to 24 age bracket. Why? Because young people aren't getting enough hours, they're working fewer hours than they used to, and also because they're entering the labour market lower down the career ladder, and they are climbing the career ladder more slowly. At the same time, as you know, we have employers saying we don't have the skills that we need to do the work that we need to do. We've got an ageing workforce, so some of those skilled workers are going to retire. So we see this paradox of young people not having enough work, not getting to use the skills they've got, while employers are saying, we can't find workers, we can't find the skills that we need. So AEN and Social Ventures Australia approached PwC to do some analysis of this problem. And what we felt was that a lot of the conversation that was occurring around what young people themselves needed to be doing, what needed to be done by or to young people. So there was a lot of discussion about training, vet reform, the need for young people to increase their employability skills, a lot of investment in training for employability skills. But of course, what is really, there is no point young people improving their skills in the abstract if they don't get the chance to use those skills, develop those skills on the job. So we're really interested in what was happening for employers. So what would it take to create an environment where employers created more opportunities for young people, not just to work, but to have a pathway into career mobility. So how can we build back careers for young people in the Australian labour market, with a particular focus on that group without university degrees? So the first step of that research was to look at what emerges from the literature and the existing research. And I'm going to quickly take you through some of these key themes, recognising, of course, I'm just touching on them, so you'll have to go to the report for a bit more detail. First thing is the number of full-time entry-level positions has declined. So, you know, that's a really significant issue for us to think about as a country. Young people are entering the labour market, but the opportunities for them have declined. Employer investment in training has also been falling. So even though we know that the labour market needs more skills, the employer investment in their workers has actually been falling. The bonds between employers and young workers have weakened. What this means is, you know, on the employer side, we see increased use of casual work, of contract work, and there's also a view that young workers won't stick around. So there's sort of this reciprocal loosening of the bonds, which is a bit of a self-perpetuating problem, because employers won't invest if they think that young people won't stick around. We're seeing a decline in career pathways in some of those larger employers that historically have been fundamental to skill formation. So in the public sector, we see that there has been, you know, privatisation, corporatisation and staffing caps have contributed to loss of some of those large intakes of apprenticeships, of trainees, and for just, you know, basic pathways for career paths into public sector. And in the private sector, we see increased use of contractors and labour hires. So we've got a more fragmented labour market with moving of responsibility away from these large entities into these supply chains, into these employment chains. There's been an increase, employers are actually asking for experience and qualifications, even in jobs which are described as entry level. So you see entry level IT jobs with 3 years experience required. Then we see there's a lack of expertise in internal structures to bring in young people and employers. This partly perhaps reflects this problem of the loss of some of those, or the stepping away of some of those large employers for doing this type of work. But there's, you know, those structures that nurtured apprentices perhaps aren't there in the same way they were, or they're not there in emerging industries. Programs like Job Active, labour market programs, are not aligned with the career development agenda. They are about getting people off welfare rather than getting them into skill pathways. The focus is not on economic mobility. And then finally, we see a lot of use of things like pilots, of temporary initiatives rather than consistent long-term support. So there are pilot schemes that come and go, that do great things, but then they vanish. So we don't see a long-term consistent approach in this area. The second part of the research was to talk to employers themselves, both through consultations and through surveys. And I'll just pull out a couple of the key findings in this area. So the first thing to say is there are some exceptional employer initiatives and some great examples of what works. But these lack scale and reach. So it's not really not knowing what to do, it's really about spreading that practice across the labour force. Many employers are not set up to engage and support young workers. So you see some of the comments that came through is we need people who are good to go from day one. Young people need more mentoring support than we normally would provide. Many said that their staff don't have time to supervise young workers, and many said that their supervisors and team leaders lack the skills to manage and support young workers. So there's just that lack of capacity. And then cost is a really important factor. So many said that they would take on more young people if the incentives were higher. Many said that cost is an important factor that limits their investment in training. But at the same time, the current wage subsidies incentives are sometimes seen as more trouble than they're worth. So there's something in the way those are developed and framed that is really making them less effective than they could be in addressing these cost pressures. And then finally, I think a really critical point, it's not just about money. Their employers are looking for non-financial support. Some of these capacity issues, these challenges in navigating the system really require intermediary support, non-financial support, not just a wage subsidy or incentive. So the final part of the report is looking at areas for action. And there were 5 types of strategies, which some combination of which we think are needed to try to address this issue. Bearing in mind that there are some really great practices and some bright spots, but the issue here is about scale, about replication, about addressing the over 600,000 young people who are in the labour market who need more work. So the first is around financial levers. I've talked about redesigning incentives, but there's also a question about whether things like the training guarantee that we used to have or the apprenticeship levy that operates in the UK should be adopted or adapted to Australia, recognising that this is an industry-wide approach. There are some employers doing more heavy lifting than others, so we need an industry-wide, a labour market-wide approach. We need better support models for employers to help them navigate, to help them build their capacity to train and retrain young people, perhaps also to share some of the risk associated with employment in these fragmented and difficult, challenging labour markets. We need collaborative pre-employment models. So there's lots of pre-employment training out there, but it is very difficult to navigate. It's not clear what works. There's not a lot of coordination and collaboration. Number 4, we know that work-integrated learning, work-based learning, the sort of apprenticeship type system works to provide career mobility for young people. But what we see is, while it exists in some traditional sectors, we're not seeing it being taken up more broadly in some of those growth sectors, emerging sectors. So we need more adoption of those models. And finally, in terms of procurement and contracting, it has become common, or in fact usual practice, to include requirements for investment in apprenticeships and in training positions in large infrastructure projects. So a similar approach could be applied to government contracting procurement in sectors like IT and some of those sectors where we have massive skill shortages and we need to somehow mobilise investment in young people. So I guess the summary of those is we need to work on the ecosystem. So we need an ecosystem that doesn't treat employment and skills as different problems, but actually integrates them and addresses them as in a long-term way. And then secondly, we think that we probably need some external push or pull to try to drive investment at scale. It's a challenging issue, but it's one that we think needs to be on the agenda. So I'm going to stop there with my whistle-stop tour of the report itself, and I'm going to ask my discussants, fellow panellists, to come and join me on the screen and for us to start to talk about what next? What are some of the implications of this report? So I'm joined by, I'm just waiting for John's screen to come on. Okay, thank you. So I've got here with me Suzi Hewlett, who is the Director of Skills for Australia at PwC, and she and her team worked tirelessly to generate this bit of report. I think that they didn't realise what they're signing up for when they agreed to do the work, but we're very grateful that they did. Gary Workman, who's the CEO of AEN, and also AEN is also the Australian body of the Global Apprenticeship Network, and Professor John Buchanan, who is the co-director of the Mental Wealth Initiative and professor in the business school at Sydney University, and as I said, a real long-term expert in this area of labour market and skills. And look, John, I'm going to start by asking you a question, because after we released the report, we did a couple of, had a bit of media coverage, and one of the responses that came from members of the public in response to that was, well, actually career paths are dead and gone. Like this is old stuff. There's no point talking about rebuilding career paths because that is no longer a feature of our economy. So I guess I'm just interested in hearing from you about, so is it pointless talking about career mobility, career paths? Is that something that's part of an old economy that doesn't exist anymore? Now you're on mute, I think, because someone had to be.
Yeah. Sorry. Look, it's a good question. And it's easy to say, that world's past. People have just got to grow up and get used to the kind of brave new world of tomorrow. Career paths are a matter of policy choice. And in the labour economics literature, there's a long-standing recognition that career paths used to be structured around what were called internal labour markets. You'd join a company and you'd move up through it. Or there were occupational labour markets where people had a craft or an occupation and they moved between employers. And then there was always a large, what was known as unstructured external labour markets, where labour was fairly homogenous and moved around pretty freely. Clearly, internal labour markets have been transformed. Employers have moved away from that, but there's still an awful lot of people who stay with the one employer for a long time. And if you look at the data on labour mobility, there are as many people today with the one employer for 20 years as there were in 1975. So let's be quite clear, there's this image of the gig economies meant that we're all moving everywhere. Labour mobility and labour stasis is pretty much as it's always been. It varies with the trade cycle, but there's a deep stasis here. So at that fundamental level, a lot of people are staying with employers for a long time. But there is a policy choice to be made. How do we shape the new employment opportunities as they emerge? And this is where we see occupational labour markets as a policy choice. And I've done quite extensive work on this in Wales, actually, and they're grappling with this issue as well. And it became very clear, if you look at, say, something like fitness instructing, right? Fitness instructing is often regarded as something that people can pick up in an ad hoc fashion. But there's some really interesting international literature which compares how the French do it, how the Norwegians do it, how the British do it. And, there isn't like a standard way in which fitness instructing happens. The French, for example, have a very codified and structured way of managing this. So different societies make different choices. So how do we want to manage the public good challenge? A good, strong occupational labour markets where we give people a clear sense of identity and a capacity to move between employers and build a career over moving between a number of employers. That's a choice we make. And in Australia, we're persistently making pretty hopeless choices. There's been a fairly strong attack on occupational labour markets since the late 80s and into the early 90s. But the impulse to try and craft these is there. I've worked with the dairy industry for many years, and they put up a whole range of things. And looking at crafting careers there, they're saying it's a responsibility for employers. It's not just up to the worker to do it. The employers have got together and they develop things like employer startup kits. They've got their own small scale labour exchanges running. And so they're trying to get people getting a sense of identity. There was a very interesting initiative up at Narrabri about 5 or 10 years ago where the cotton farmers got together with construction and local government employees to try and get a sense of rural operations as a domain where people could get one job in one area and then move around. That failed to materialise primarily because of public policy support. You had the local council interested, you had local construction employers and cotton farmers interested. But if government policy does not support this stuff, it doesn't work. I mean, occupation, like doctors' labour markets are buttressed by government policy. You know, the teachers' labour markets and nurses, there's strong government support for these things. And I think if we're interested in this, we've really got to think about what are the support structures we put in place. And I wasn't paid to say this. I think the most important occupational structure we can work with are the group training companies. Like Australia is very lucky. Australia pioneered group training, right? These are ethical labour hire organisations which link fragments of jobs and the central entity, the group training organisation, links those up and gives people a chance to build a solid skills base and move amongst employers. We have treated our group training companies appallingly. You know, I started researching this in the 90s and I was brought in just at the time we were told we had to marketise group training. We had to introduce competition. What a dumb idea. You know, you don't build careers by creating competition. Careers and occupational mobility is a public good. It's just a really silly idea to say that somehow competition is going to create coherence in the labour market. And so I did work for ANTA, as it then what the Australian National Training Authority as it then was, and then for the group training companies. And there are 4 principles you should be following if you want to use group training as a platform for building up careers. First of all, the company should operate on a not-for-profit basis. You don't want to have people going in there motivated by profit. You want them to go in there motivated by a commitment to quality jobs. Only group training companies that provide an employment guarantee for people on their books should survive, so that you just don't get opportunists who go in there and basically be real estate agents in the labour market. They take responsibility for, if they can't find a host employer, they will accelerate the off-the-job training or provide other employment. I think that's the third condition, is that the real strength of the group training companies is not just that it builds up a sense of occupational coherence, they help employers. Like the guts of a group training organisation is its field officer staff, and they work with host employers to structure up on the job training, and in that way help the employer as much as they help the trainee. And then finally, and I think more ambitiously, there's a role for group training organisations to start thinking about what are the modern domains for career. And I've done a lot of work with the New South Wales government in looking at flows through the labour market. So we looked at 420 different occupational groups. We look at their flows over 8 years. And when you look at those 420 different occupational groups and you cluster them, you find that there are organic links between different types of occupational roles. And to cut a long story short, the most exciting one is modern service work is not just people who are care workers or customer service workers or clerical workers. People move between those domains. And so when we think about a career in today and into the future, we should be looking at how do we get these new, what we call vocational streams. So that's a long way of answering your question. It's not the career paths are dead. It's basically we've got a choice to make, and they're not dead. We haven't actually revitalised them and brought them to life in a way that we possibly could.
You know, the idea of the internal labour market, start with a company, move your way through, is much easier to get your head around, your arms around, than this sort of fragmented, you know, hop from here to there. And I think, you know, perhaps that's one of the challenges that we're seeing emerging for young people and for employers. And it's very interesting you talking about competition, because what we heard from employers was they have trouble navigating. And of course, as soon as you have a lot of different actors, then the navigation challenge becomes a problem. Gary, I sort of feel like John's sort of talked a bit about GTOs, but I did want to ask you, you know, because GTOs really were established in the 80s in response to this problem about fragmentation of labour, of you know, this more precarious, insecure work. So I'm interested in your thoughts about, so what role, what next for GTOs? How could they play a part in addressing the sorts of challenges that have been identified here? And I should just say to those people in the questions and the you know, who've got questions, I'm noticing it. We'll come to you. So we'll just try it. Yeah, it's good. We've got a bit of time. So Gary.
Thanks, Lisa. And look, John's right. Group training was set up in the 80s to look at some of these challenges that we're talking about still today in 2021. A lot of, in Australia, we have a lot of small businesses. Geographically, we're spread out across a wide-ranging area. It was grown out of the need in the construction sector to how do we bring in more young skilled workers? How do we give them an opportunity to be supported by a small business that may not be willing to take them on for the full 4 years? I think historically, one of the issues is the name. A lot of people, when they hear group training, they actually think we're a training organisation, but we rely on the TAFE sector. We're actually the legal employer of the young person, and it's our responsibility to find the skill shortages in the local community, find the best match with a small business and place that young person in a supported environment, and then rotate that young person as they're needed to other employers or as their training requirements need, so they get a fully rounded qualification at the end of it. We have about 10% of apprentices employed through group training in the sector. The government have introduced a lot of different intermediary models in the past, but they're all focused on the job seeker, not necessarily the employer and the support that they require. But our data shows that for it to be a successful completion through group training, we lose about 10% of our apprentices by poaching. So SMEs wait until the young person's sufficiently skilled and then they'll take them on themselves, and that shows as a cancellation for a group training company. We find that every young person has to be rotated at least once, and that might be because it's a poor match, or it's an OH&S issue, or there's a downturn in the economy, or they're just not getting the full breadth of the skills that they require. So there's a lot of work that's going to be needed to support young people to develop the skills that they're going to need, that industry are looking for. And if we don't support businesses to do this, I don't think we're going to really achieve it. All the intermediary models out there looking at the job seeker is great, but I think we've segmented that market to such small groups that it becomes competitive, as John mentioned. It becomes confusing for employers, and employers are looking for that support and, I guess, flexibility to grow the skills that the industry needs, not necessarily what they need for the long term, because a lot of small businesses don't think long term. They actually only look for their immediate labour needs that they may have in the next 12 months at best. And a lot of it depends on the contracts that they're running in the economy. So, you know, group training was established. We lost our funding at a Commonwealth level in 2015. And group training companies have been really agile in this space. We've had, you know, we've had the GFC in 2009, and then the government focused a lot of efforts around workforce development, but it was focused on training, and there was a bit of rorting that went on in the system. But group training companies have survived people that have come and gone from the system that are a little bit opportunistic. But if we really want to make significant change, we've got to reinvest in that not-for-profit, at that community level or industry-specific level, which group training was initially established for. And I think you can get scale if you build the capacity in that space.
Suzi, I'll hand over to you now. I mean, one of the reasons that AN and SVA approached PwC is because they'd done some really interesting work in creating new types of pathways into their own organisation and for others. So I thought it'd be great to hear a little bit about why you did that and what your experience was, because I think it's a really interesting insight into what the future could hold, what a new fashioned version of some of these strategies. sorry, without wanting, by which I am not meaning to say GTO's time has gone, because they're clearly from this report even more fundamental because of the fragmentation. But what I mean is in new industries, right? Here's an approach to a new industry. So Suzi.
Many thanks for that introduction, Lisa. And I might attempt to share my screen here.
I think we might have accidentally lost her.
My humble, am I back? I think what I might do, Lisa, rather than trying to share my screen again, given the time available, I'm very happy to give people a few slides. But what I might do is just make a number of points about the higher apprenticeship and traineeship pilot that PwC undertook, starting off in 2017, that went over a couple of years. So what we were trying to do was emulate the sort of successes that that a number of countries such as the UK had with combining higher level qualifications with work integrated learning. So we undertook the pilot with a range of other employers, the ACT government, CSIRO, Gold Coast Health, some small IT companies, Intellidocs, Netier and Veritac, as well as Woolworths. So we wanted to get an experience with large employers and with small and medium enterprises. And the focus was in the sort of professional business and IT occupations. When we did the evaluation in 2019, that there were a number of participants that were still finishing their off-the-job training, but the completion rates even at that point were nearly 90%, which is much higher than the Australian apprenticeship average completion rate. Some elements of the enhancement program that we thought would go well, like a mentoring element and additional learning events apart from the qualifications, were slightly less effective than we thought that they would be. But overall, 88% of the employers were satisfied with their experience, and a pretty similar number of the apprentices were also satisfied with their overall experience. While it's too early to tell the long-term impacts on perceptions of apprenticeships, which was one of the objectives of the program, the pilot successfully built recognition and interest in higher apprenticeships. And the pilot can be said to have been successful in promoting vocational education and training more broadly in industries that typically value university qualifications. And I hope that the pilot was influential when the Commonwealth Government negotiated the Skilling Australians Fund National Partnership Agreement with the states and territories, because there was a target of over 10% of those commencements being at diploma or advanced diploma level, so around 20,000 by 2021. And it would be very interesting to see when the Commonwealth evaluates that program, how successful higher apprenticeships have been more broadly. Since the pilot finished, all of those employers and many of the young people that were engaged in the pathway have become strong advocates for the program. And in fact, when we were supporting SVA and the AEN in What Will It Take reporting, we had one of our former higher apprentices working on the program with us. In terms of the feedback that we got from employers about that particular program, and again, they came up as we were doing the consultations for What Will It Take. Employers were very keen to emphasise that they needed additional support for the recruitment and the ongoing management for their young apprentices, and they couldn't, particularly the small and medium enterprises, couldn't do it all by themselves. The other thing around recruitment was that it was very difficult for employers without existing relationships with schools to engage young people. So involving employers in school to work transition programs, I think, is really important in easing recruitment challenges and also perception issues around young people. And many employers, and again through the consultation process around what will it take, were still unaware of this sort of higher apprenticeship model and using that traditional kind of trade apprenticeship model in a broader range of industries and with a broader range of qualifications. Yeah, 2 or 3 other points I just wanted to make, and then I'll hand back because I'm conscious of the time. Employer-to-employer recruitment conversations were critical in attracting high-quality employers to the program. I think we couldn't emphasise that enough. Employers to engage, they trust other employers and their experiences, and it's really important to get a broader range of employers promoting this sort of approach to recruiting young people into organisations. The other thing people emphasised was partnering with quality training providers that were willing to assist employers in assessing their business needs and customising the course content of the qualifications to the individual workplace was really crucial to the success in the program. So I think absolutely our pilot demonstrated that the higher apprenticeship model meets a gap in the current education and training landscape and a career pathway for young people. But it's still, as I think Lisa said, and Gary has mentioned, many of these initiatives, many of these pilots don't actually get picked up in the mainstream quickly enough. And so PwC continues to promote this approach to taking young people on into our business and more broadly. So Lisa, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I guess a reflection is that, it's taken a long time to develop the apprenticeship system, right? It's been around since the Middle Ages. It's a very old system. So to build a new culture in these sectors that didn't exist back there in professional services, in IT, it's going to take time, and it's going to take, investment until those pathways are established. So I guess this is, one of the challenges is that it's not just like throwing boosting apprenticeship commencement subsidy at those sectors. It actually needs investment in culture, in creating cultures in institutional structures, which is why the sort of stop-start thing is so complicated. Yeah. So look, we've got a question here from Carly. So Carly, I apologise for, maybe reading this in the way that you don't want, but anyway, so I've got great interest in how we better help our youth. I feel the market is flooded with choices. It's so confusing to young people. How do we help young people identify skill shortage areas, and how do we give them opportunities to try different industries in a safe manner? So look, Gary, I thought I might hand this one to you, because I know this is something that you and your members have been thinking about a bit, is how do you give young people the chance to figure out what to do?
Yeah, look, thanks, Lisa. Again, I think one of the problems from a government perspective, we only have about 50% of our young people actually complete anything they start, whether that's a university degree or an apprenticeship. So, I think, how do we actually start to give them greater experiences and opportunities at a younger age so they can make a better informed choice? We ran some programs called multi-industry pre-apprenticeships. It wasn't a new concept. A lot of training companies around the country have been running taster programs for a number of years. And we think the earlier you can do that in a secondary school environment. A lot of secondary schools are focused purely on an academic pathway, but giving them an opportunity to explore vocations and the world of work and learn with their hands and try and explore what they're good at and where these industries may take them in the future. So there's a lot of exciting technology out there, 3D printing, robotics, programming. A lot of industries are going to need these technologies. But a lot of people, especially when we talk to young people, they can only name 3 or 4 career pathways. And a lot of them are usually university career pathways. When you talk to them about trades, they talk about plumbers, electricians and carpenters. But, there's 500 qualifications in the vet sector. How do we get young people to explore this in a safe environment? We tried a program with GTOs where they had 3 or 4 different industry sectors. They picked those industry sectors based on the employment opportunities at that community level. The idea was then we put them in a safe environment like a TAFE environment. They do some hands-on training. They do a bit of exploratory work on what are these industries going to look like in the future? What does it take to get a career? What does it take to be successful? And then actually place them with employers looking for young people. So they did some real-life work experience. One of the things we found was over 55% of the young people changed their mind. So they came in saying, I wanted to be an X, and they left saying they wanted to be something different. So again, I think that comes back to we're not giving them an opportunity to explore. And the way that the current system is set up is they've actually got to enrol in something and use up their eligibility and use up government funding to see if they're going to like it. So we've got to actually go back from that. And I think we can make a massive amount of government saving and a lot of saving of time for employers and young people if we actually give them that environment to begin with. And some of the countries that do this really well, their youth unemployment is low and their skill shortages are low and their engagement by their employers is a lot higher. So to me, that's no coincidence that these countries that have got it right use this model at a secondary school level.
Did others, John or Suzi, want to chime in there? I guess one of the things I would say there is that the same issues that arise in terms of giving young people a go at starting an apprenticeship or, starting with an employer also arise in engaging with schools. And I think, Suzi, you mentioned that employers without connections to schools really, sort of struggle to try to bring young people in. But I also heard from others who try to organise school programs that getting employers to, commit to working in schools, and obviously it becomes even harder at the smaller end of the of size of employers is really difficult. So we do need intermediaries to really work in this space too, to make it really easy for employers to engage with schools and for schools to find employers, right? So clearly the GTOs were able to do this in this case because of their networks, but that industry, everyone knows industry tasters are fantastic, right? But they're just not available at scale. We just don't see them at scale. So when we think about intermediaries, this strikes me as one of the areas that is a fairly obvious one where they could play a critical role. So look, we've got a question here from Andrew too, and John, I'm going to pass this on to the economists in the room about how does temporary, low and semi-skilled migration factor into this equation. So preferred government policy seems to be to bring in skills rather than building capacity around generating skills amongst our young people.
Yeah, look, I think that's a very important issue. I think it's the pandemic has exposed how the Australian labour market has basically been structured around influxes of cheap labour, literally by the hundreds of thousands, and then employers were caught with their pants down when the pandemic led to the closure of the borders. So this is a problem, and that's very clear that people say, let's let the market sort it out. That's not the market sorting it out. That's active immigration policy. That's the government taking a position. And I think instead of just trying to get back to business as usual, the thing I really liked about your report is if you look at the data very closely, And I'd suggest the audience has a look at this. Basically, all the data in your report shows Australia never really recovered from the GFC. Right? If you look at all that data, Australia has had an anemic labour market. We've fooled ourselves that we had 30 years of uninterrupted growth. Well, tell that to a young person looking for a job, because employers haven't been chasing them. There's been, you had that issue of unemployment and underemployment. So for the government to now say it's got to lurch overseas to fill these skills gaps is basically trying to say we want to get back to what life was like after the GFC. And that's part of the problem. That's not part of the solution, that's part of the problem. And I think this is where the report's important. We've got to have a different engagement with employers, and simply engaging to what I would call those who are looking for the easy solutions. We've got to give voice to those employers who take responsibility for this stuff. And Gary would know that. The group training network, it often networks those people. You know, Suzi's got a great example with her company. Those people exist, but they're not the ones who are shaping policy. It's those who say, I can't get the cheap labour I need when I need it. That's the problem. Well, I think policymakers should turn around and say, no, you're the problem. You're designing the vacancy in a way that is unsustainable. And just to take up your point that you led in with, was the whole importance of intermediaries. Let's be quite clear, what kind of intermediaries do we want? We don't need more real estate agents in the labour market, right? In the social policy world, you know, there's disability employment service providers, there's the jobs networks. They're like one step up from real estate agents. They're not actually deeply embedded in the employment relationship. And this is where I return to the theme of group training. What is defining about group training as an intermediary is that they are the employer, right? When the group training company has a relationship with employers, it is they are sharing the responsibility for employment. And so, yes, let's not talk about how we can get more cheap labour in or more skilled labour in through migration. Let's look at what Australia's done well, which is pioneer this new ethical form of labour hire, and really take that to the next level. It came out of the crisis, the late 70s, early 80s. It was, you know, handled very badly with the kind of free market turn to policy in the 90s. We've got a chance to do it again. Let's not talk about, you know, recovery. Let's talk about reconstruction. And I think group training provides a very useful reference point for thinking about how we can do that differently.
Thanks, John. I mean, I think that this discussion of intermediaries is a really important one, and it is certainly one of the findings in the report is that we just really need to think what's there in the landscape. And I guess I wanted to ask you, Suzi, for your reflections on this. I mean, we've got apprenticeship support network providers, we've got job providers, we've got GTOs, we've got RTOs, we've got a whole bunch of, you know, skills organisations, all sorts of, you know, organisations that sort of are in this space in some broad sense. But where do you see some of the gaps? You know, what's, you know, if we had to sort of summarise where there needed to be some action, you know, how would you describe it?
I like John, and I'm in awe of what Gary and the GTO network have done, and it is, I'm very proud that we do it's an Australian initiative. I think that there are 2 or 3 things that we learned from what essentially was an intermediary role when we did our pilot. So even though we had people within PwC, we were working with a whole bunch of other employers, as I mentioned earlier on. And I think one of the key things was that negotiation with the training providers. Employers are not aware of the range of qualifications that are out there in vet land. They're also not aware of the range of RTOs that are available, or the mode of delivery. And one of a number of employers talk to us about the importance of being able to bring the RTO into the workplace and not just have all of the apprentices go to TAFE or go to an institution, partly because it meant that the training organisations understood much more clearly the context in which they were working in, and so the materials that they were using and the content was much more relevant because they were actually in the workplace. But it had this byproduct of enabling the supervisors of the young people to see what they were learning, and then being able to reinforce that learning by the tasks that they gave the apprentices in, you know, the following week. So there was the facilitating, the intermediary facilitating the partnership between the training provider and the employer was really, really important. One of the other things that we learned, and this is something that I wouldn't do again, I think we've identified that mentoring is a really important element of supporting a young person stay on a career pathway, both within the workplace and also with their qualification. We thought it would be a great thing to do to mix up the employers and the apprentices, and so we had employers from Woolworths mentoring people within IntelliDocs, for example. And it actually, it didn't work as well as we thought it was going to. They didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the reinforcing knowledge of the industry that a young person had chosen. So while the intent was good, I would do it very differently next time and make sure that you've got a mentor that is much more familiar with the young person, the qualification and the workplace than we did that time round. But yeah, I think that connection with the really intense connection with the training provider and the employer is really important.
And as you say, employers shouldn't have to be an expert in qualifications packages and, you know, have training providers to do it. Listen, we're running out of time, but I was keen to get Beth Worrell from Microsoft Foundation on the line as well, because Beth has been working on a really interesting traineeship program, and you know, made a comment in the chat about how to engage employers in that. So keen to hear from you, Beth.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. So I'm joining this conversation from my sick bed, such is my passion for this topic. So I've been setting up the Microsoft traineeship program for the last couple of years. And with respect, I'd challenge some of the statements here. So we're huge fan of group training organisations. I think it's such a unique offering that we have here in Australia, and we could do more to make use of those, as well as build their capacity to extend from traditional apprenticeships and traineeships into the, you know, quote unquote white collar type roles. But I have spoken, as have my group training organisation partner, we have spoken to literally hundreds, if not 1,000 organisations these last few years. And I can say that organisations are often unfamiliar with the opportunities, but even when they become familiar, and even with really quite compelling results from our program, it's still not enough to get them to commit. And so I would challenge that statement around organisations not being familiar, because I think it's not enough. There is lack of incentive, and so we have worked to model our program on what our UK subsidiary have done, and with the tax incentive that the UK government has set up for governments, and almost an obligation for organisations to take on trainees and apprentices, they're training tens of thousands of young people and creating these pathways into employment. And if tax incentives are too hard in the short term, could governments do something creative through social procurement policies, or other organisations include this in social procurement policies? So I, as someone who has banged on about this, you can tell I've almost lost my voice, such as the amount of conversations I've had these last few years. I have told thousands of people, and it's still not enough. So I think you know, what will it take? It will take action from government to create the incentive in the system. We've had 20,000 young people apply to our program. These people are passionate. I know that this program changes lives. What we need is employers to create entry-level roles. thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you so much, Beth. I mean, I think one of the, catchphrases in this was necessary but not sufficient. So wage subsidies, necessary but not sufficient. Intermediaries, necessary but not sufficient. And that's why we sort of also include this push-pull. What can we do? Either push the sort of apprenticeship levy type approach, or pull procurement. Partly because it can't be up to the sole champions of youth employment to carry the flag. We actually sort of need industry change, and that's a really terrific reflection. Thank you. Look, I'm conscious of time, so I wanted to just give our panellists one last moment to add anything that they wanted to add before we say goodbye. So look, what a great conversation. So I'll pass over to you, John. Did you want to add anything, just final comments? You're mute. You wouldn't think you'd been doing it for 2 years,
sorry.
would you?
Sorry. Look, there's a good question in the Q&A about young people presenting with mental health challenges. And I think I don't want to let that go unnoticed. I think that's a really important point. And I suppose the point that I'd like to really like to reinforce what Beth said. Many businesses are not in business to create jobs. They're in business to survive in a very hostile commercial environment. So if we really want to boost employment levels, it's a public good. The governments have got to be actively involved. They've got to support intermediaries like group training. And the thing is, taking this issue of mental health, for example, there are a lot of young people who've got mental health issues. It's very hard for employers to take that on. That's the beauty of the group training organisation. The field officers can play that mediating role. And I saw this when I was looking at Indigenous workers in a property services training company 15 years ago. The employers were just really happy to have somebody there who could handle the complex cultural issues there. They wanted to boost their engagement with the Indigenous community, but they didn't know where to start. A group training company could come in and really help them. So that's where I come from. There's a deep problem here. The government needs to intervene, and I think group training and getting in behind group training to help get employers over the line is a key role for me.
Yeah, thanks for picking that up, John. That was a really important point, and just reinforces that question about employer capacity, but the need for a broader ecosystem to support that. Suzi, did you want to make some final comments?
Thank you, Lisa, and really just to in many ways echo and emphasise Beth's point about that communication. When we talked about our 5 options in the What Will It Take report, there is no silver bullet. We all know that, but the combination of things is a really powerful way of getting young people career pathways in the current labour market.
And Gary, final word to you.
Thanks, Lisa. And yeah, just reinforcing what John and Beth and Suzi have said. I think the report's highlighted that there's no one silver bullet for this. There's no one simple answer. It's going to be a combination of things that we're going to need to work on. Governments have tended to rely on wage subsidies as short-term problem solvers, but we've also conditioned our employers to expect a wage subsidy to get into this space. So we've got to change that culture and that thinking. And after the last GFC, 10 years ago, we went into wage subsidies and some support programs, and then employers were looking for flexibility and short-term thinking to get their skills needs. So we can't repeat the problems from 10 years ago. And again, government are probably one of the early adopters in this space. So they've got to, walk the talk. They've got to look at those community social procurement programs. They've got to employ more young people themselves. They've got to create more opportunities. And then they've got to start adding that, whether it's through tax incentives or through contractual procurement arrangements. I think we can start there, and then hopefully over time employers will come on board more and more.
Thank you all. I'd like to thank panellists, but also participants. It's been a really terrific discussion, and I hope that we'll continue. And look, we will circulate, as I said, the slides and the recording, and we'd welcome contact from any of you that would like to work with us on continue to pursue this challenge of rebuilding career paths for young Australians. So thank you.